So with that, I'm going to introduce our guest speaker. Thank you, Kim, for being here today. Kim Dinkins is Save the Manatee Club's Senior Conservation Associate. She's relatively new to manatee issues. Much of her career has focused on water supply, planning, and water quality issues at local and state levels. She's very passionate about protecting Florida's waterways for manatees and humans alike. So let's put our hands together and welcome Kim. Thank you, Kim.
Thank you, Lisa.
Stay in the box.
I'm going to stay in the box, which is not something I'm usually accused of doing, sticking in the box. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. I really appreciate you spending your lunch with us. And I hope that you learned something today that helps you be inspired to protect manatees. As Lisa said, my background is in water quality and water supply planning. This is kind of my first foray into manatees and the Indian River Lagoon. Oops. I'm sorry, I'm missing my... Oh, I left it on. I'm so sorry. Clearly not a professional presenter. I left the box and okay, we're moving along. All right, so we all know and love manatees, but I wanted to start out with some basic manatee information. They are large, slow-moving animals that average about 10 feet long and can be about 1,000 pounds. Like all mammals, they give live birth and they care for their young on average of about 2 years. They eat salt and freshwater vegetation, primarily submerged aquatic vegetation, but they've been known to eat vegetation off the shoreline, so they'll prop themselves up, they'll eat floating vegetation and basically whatever's in the water, that's available to them. They breathe every 3 to 5 minutes, but they can rest on the bottom for about 20 minutes. So sometimes people get concerned that manatees aren't breathing, but they're just resting. One of the big things about manatees that I didn't know before I started working with them is that they have to maintain a temperature of above 68 degrees Fahrenheit. So and they can't live in cold water for very long. And this has become like a challenging issue for manatees in Florida. So we'll talk a little bit about power plants and springs and how we've made some modifications to our environment that are challenging for them. Okay. Manatees are in the order Sirenia. There are 2 taxonomic they're in the Sirenia order. They are Trichicidae and Dugonidae. So within those 2 families, we have the Amazonian manatee, the West Indian manatee, the West African, and then the dugong in the Dugonidae. But in Florida, we have essentially the West Indian manatee, and that's the Florida manatee, and then the Antillean manatee. So Antillean manatees are found in that northern South America area. Save the Manatee Club has been around for 41 years, and we work anywhere that there are manatees and dugongs. So we have done projects in Belize. We help with conservation funding, education, and then helping with manatees that are in captivity. Our significant research is in Volusia Blue Spring. And so Cora Burcham is here with me today if you have any questions about that, but we'll talk about that a little bit more. Manatees have been in Florida longer than we have, at least our colonial ancestors have. They date back to the fossil record of 45 million years, and then our more modern manatees are about 1 million years old. They did not come over with Christopher Columbus. They are not part of that whole colonization of America. They've been here a long time. I do know that our early sailors thought that they were mermaids, so that's why we have that order Sirenia. Their closest relatives are elephants and hyraxes. Hyraxes are found in Africa. They're like a small squirrel-like animal. They're furry. They don't look anything like elephants. They have little small tails, but interesting how diverse this evolutionary history is. So manatees can eat up to 10% of their body weight every day. They don't always eat that much. Sometimes they'll eat, less, 30%, and they're not all 1,000 pounds. So they're not all out there eating hundreds of pounds of vegetation each day. They are the only entirely herbivorous marine mammal in North and Central America. Again, they eat all types of submerged aquatic vegetation, and they've co-evolved with these systems. So where we have SAV and manatees are eating, they typically act like a lawnmower, and they actually integrate back into the system. They will get hungry though, and they'll start rooting up those areas. So where we've lost submerged aquatic vegetation and we have manatees, oftentimes they will make it more difficult for that SAV to regenerate. They have what we call marching molars, which means that when they lose a tooth, those teeth are replaced throughout their lifetime, not just as juveniles. And another thing that's not on this slide but is interesting is that they can live to be about 50 years old. So manatees aren't fat, they're just big boned. They have very little body fat, in fact, which is why they have trouble in cold water. Their bones are very dense, and there's a manatee skeleton in the back I think you're allowed to touch. You'll notice that those bones for the ribs are very heavy, whereas their vertebrae are not. So there's no marrow in those bones, and that helps them with buoyancy. But their lungs take up about a third of the length of their body or more. So when a manatee is hit by a watercraft, oftentimes what kills that manatee is not those superficial wounds, but a rib splinter and that punctures their lungs. Manatees don't have any natural predators. This is our friend gator hanging out with his friend gator, the gator. But they do have a lot of unnatural threats. So we'll talk about those a little bit more. I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about where manatees can be found. Historically, we think about them as being the Florida manatee, and they are here during the wintertime. The majority of the population is going to be found in Florida. During the summertime, they can be found as far west as Texas and as far north as the Carolinas. But we have a few wanderers out there. This is an adoption certificate for Isla. Isla was found in New Jersey. And then you might have heard of Chessie. Chessie was rescued in Massachusetts. He was rescued once in Massachusetts, was rehabbed and released, and then came back last year as a emaciated animal with pneumonia. So he was rescued and then released again. And now he's been seen hanging around in Fort Lauderdale and Jacksonville. So that's where he likes to be. So manatees can live in a variety of habitats. They can really be anywhere and even places that you would not expect a manatee to be. Often they can be found in rivers, or springs, canals, bays, and estuaries. They have been known to get themselves stuck into culverts, and we recently rescued one that was found in a ditch that came in during a high tide and then ended up being stranded there. So these guys are pretty ubiquitous without our water quality, without our water systems. And so we have to be very careful wherever we're recreating in our waterways. This slide shows you kind of our warm water habitats for manatees. So these are very important. They're critical to their survival in the wintertime. They, in general, like to be in subtropical locations, and again, they have to find warm water when it drops below 68 degrees. The manatee population has been classified into 4 distinct regions, and today we're going to talk about this Atlantic coast region and a little bit about the St. Johns River region. The most recent published population information that we have was a count of about 8,800 manatees. We expect that manatee population is pretty well distributed throughout the state, so we're looking at about 4,400 on each coast. In good situations. You'll note that in the Indian River Lagoon area, there are 2 natural warm water systems. Those are like DeSoto and Satellite Beach. They are thermal basins. And then the other areas that manatees seek refuge in the winter are power plants. So the Indian River Lagoon is important for manatees. It always has been because it actually takes up the majority of the coast, about 150 miles. It has calm waters and it's very shallow, so it has mangroves and plenty to eat most of the time. It's home to thousands of manatees year round, but it has the most during the winter time again. Up to 70% of the population, of the East Coast population, can be found in the Indian River Lagoon in the winter. So there's 2 reasons. We have those thermal basins and we have those power plants. Other refuges for manatees in the wintertime are springs. So these are our natural refuges. They're 72 degrees year round. Manatees need fresh water, but they can go for long periods of time without it, so up to 2 weeks in some cases. About 15 to 20% of our East Coast population overwinters in Blue Spring, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But again, about 60% of them rely on power plants. The other 20 will be in the thermal basins in southern Florida. So in Florida, we have about 1,000 springs, but the largest accessible spring for manatees on the eastern coast is at Volusia Blue Spring that I talked about before. There are springs that are inhibited. There's inhibited access for manatees, and that's in that St. Johns River system. But Blue Spring is a first magnitude spring. That means that it discharges at least 65 million gallons of water per day. Blue Spring itself is about 100 million gallons of water per day. That's enough to fill 150 plus Olympic-sized swimming pools, or is just a little bit less than the daily use of Jacksonville. So it's a pretty big discharge. Here we're going to talk about what we've done to manatees and their habitat, which has become the biggest challenge that we really face for long-term survival of the species, we think. So we have created these power plants that provide year-round discharge of warm water for manatees. There are 10 plants around the state that manatees use for thermal regulation during the winter time. But as these power plants start to age out, they're going to be coming off of line. And so we have a concern about that. Our natural systems, our springs, have been altered. We have dams. This map on the left-hand side shows you over 1,000 dams that we have in Florida. When we got here in the 20s, we started building power plants. Right after that, we said, oh, we don't really like the way this whole Okeechobee system works, and we're not that excited about living inland. We'd like to live next to the coast. So we started building all these dams, backfilling wetlands, backfilling creeks. Some of those thermal areas that manatees might have found in historic times are very likely covered up or otherwise destroyed through our development. So that's going to be a very big problem for manatees moving forward. And really, it looks like the best way to improve manatees long-term is to provide that access to those natural areas. So I want to go back real quick and talk about another challenge, that is that manatees show strong site fidelity. They learn where to go during the wintertime from their moms. So generationally, they'll go to the same place. So in the Indian River Lagoon, we have a habitat in peril. I let you know how important the Indian River Lagoon is, and most of you have probably seen this slide before. In 2013, those dark areas represent our seagrass coverage, and then in 2020, those tan areas are the bare spots where there was at one time seagrass and no longer is. So that's a major concern for manatees, and most of you probably are aware that we are experiencing a unusual mortality event. So our current catastrophe is based on this loss of seagrass. It was identified in late 2020, December. The researchers were noticing that there were a number of manatees dying. And at first they thought it was due to cold stress because they were seeing the same symptoms, lethargic animals with muscle atrophy. But then they realized pretty quickly that something more was going on. They applied for this unusual mortality event designation which is coordinated through NOAA, and they were granted that almost immediately. I guess they have a 24-hour period to turn that around. So far, we have lost 1,100 in 2021, and then over 500 this year in 2022. Again, attributed to the habitat loss in the Indian River Lagoon, and that's due to persistent algal blooms and lack of degrading water quality. I will talk a little bit about the UME and the Unified Command that was established this last winter. We recognized pretty early on that we were going to have a continued situation of manatee mortality. And so the Fish and Wildlife Service worked with the Fish and Wildlife Commission to establish a pilot scale feeding program for manatees. And at this time, we don't know if that will be continued into the future, but it is a short-term solution. So as of now, I let you know that we had more than 500 more deaths in 2022 so far, and we're not even halfway through the year, and the current UME is still ongoing. But I also want to make sure that you're aware that there was another UME in 2013, around that time that we first started seeing this habitat shift. We had a UME related to the macroalgae that manatees were feeding on, which contained bacteria that caused an infectious disease. So as of now, we don't know what the long-term impacts of this UME will be. We know that we are seeing more, well, I say we know, we're hearing accounts of more calves without mothers. And then we don't know what the reproductive implications will be. So will those females that are of reproductive age be able to carry calves? Will they be able to care for them into the future? So that's another thing that we're very concerned about. We also have, in addition to this, the ongoing concerns about boat strikes, locks, and entanglements that kill manatees every year. But I want to shift gears and talk about a nice, happy place for manatees. It is called Blue Spring. It's a little bit northwest of here in Volusia County. It's about halfway between Orlando and Daytona Beach, and it is that first magnitude spring that I was talking about before. It is the biggest spring along the St. Johns system that's easily accessible for manatees, and they've been coming there since the 1800s. We have records of manatees being there. It is state-owned, and it's managed as a manatee sanctuary in the wintertime. So there's not only no swimming, but they also have a moratorium on herbicides in that area. Oh, I'm sorry. All of this information that I just told you is in these little bullets. So we have a long history of continuous research in Blue Spring. We've been studying manatees there since about the 1970s. And they come there again because of that nice warm water. This is a fairly short spring run. They go to the St. Johns River to feed, but it's only about half a mile away from the main spring. So there's not a lot of vegetation in the spring. They kind of huddle up there, and then throughout the day they'll go out and feed. And this is a completely different system. Not a lot of submerged aquatic vegetation in the St. Johns River. It's mostly floating aquatic vegetation. Oh, there's more. Again, protected sanctuary. All right, so Cora Burcham, who's here with me today, and Wayne Hartley, who is not here but has been a researcher with us for a long time, do our research in Blue Spring. And again, they've been doing that since the 1970s. This is mainly a photo ID and genealogy project. Two of the manatees that come to Blue Spring, Merlin and Brutus, were recorded there when Jacques Cousteau came in the 1970s and did his famous documentary, The Forgotten Mermaids. Sorry, I'm gonna go through these real quickly. So every morning during the winter season, when it's cold enough and we think we're gonna see manatees, Cora and Wayne get in their canoe, and they manually count the manatees along 19 transects of this spring run. They identify manatees based on their scars, which is the typical way that we identify manatees. It's been the way that we've identified manatees since the early 1900s when powerboats became prominent in Florida. Over 90% of manatees have some sort of scar, typically from a watercraft injury, which is pretty sad, but it does allow us to help identify them. And another interesting fact is about 25% of manatees, when they're dead, when they die and we look at them, we can find evidence that they've been hit over 10 times throughout their lifetime. So that's quite a big number of manatees to be hit so many times. So they use scar sheets and photographs, and they submit their data to the Manatee Individual Photo Identification Database. It's called MIPS. It was typically overseen by the Fish and Wildlife Service, but it's recently been handed off to the Fish and Wildlife Commission, which is our state organization. Others that are doing similar research also submit their data to MIPS, and so there's this large database of manatee identification throughout the state. One thing that Cora and Wayne do that others don't is that they record boat strikes. They also record the number of calves, and they record the number of manatees who stay there over the season. So when last thing that they do is that they identify when a manatee dies, they'll look back through their records, and so they can see if a manatee has spent any time at Blue Spring over its lifetime. This is an example of a hand-drawn scar sheet. Cora and Wayne use these daily in their observations. So they don't take the pictures out, they take these scar sheets out. Each scar sheet has the scar, the name of the animal, the year it was first identified, and then the formal number. So matching manatees isn't always easy. This is the most interesting thing, I think, is that, you know, scars heal and change. New scars can cover old scars. So this is not an easy task for our researchers. They might predict that they'll see a scar heal in one way and then it heals a completely different way. So Moira Rose in 2021 came in with some fresh scars. And as you can see in the photo to the right, those scars are almost invisible this year. So if they didn't already have record of Moira Rose, they might not be able to recognize that she had been there before. This is an example of a manatee that had, hold on, I've got two here, just two manatees where the one on the bottom was a fresh hit in 2020, and it healed almost exactly the way that they thought that it would. But then on the right-hand side, there was a fresh hit on a manatee in 2020, and when it came back, that was unrecognizable. So they have a very methodical way of labeling the animals when they first come in. If they are unidentified, but it's the first time they see them and they think that they'll be able to identify them again, they give them a U. If they think that they won't be able to identify them again, they give them an S. And then at the end of the year, at the end of the season, if they see them multiple times, they give them a BS for blue spring, not what initially comes to your mind, blue spring. And those manatees are kept in our records throughout the length of our record keeping. This is an example of a manatee genealogy. It is 7 generations of manatees based on the maternity. So we don't know, manatees breed in herds. The papas don't hang out with the families. So they are all entirely done by maternity. But Dawn was seen in the 1980s. And then we have Volusia, who was our most recent calf of this on this family tree. One of the most encouraging things that I've seen this year is that we get manatees in Blue Spring from other areas. So this is 6 new manatees that were not observed before, but were observed last year. Most of them are from the Brevard area. And so we're seeing new animals come in. Oh, sorry about that. So we have these from Brevard County. We have one from Silver Glen, which is a spring along that St. Johns River that I was talking about before. And then from Riviera Beach, which is south of here. There's other things that are part of the research. We assist with the manatee release, rescue, and recovery. I'm thinking about the MRPP, which we'll talk about in just a second. But we also assist with post-release monitoring. The reasons that manatees have to be rescued are those watercraft injuries, entanglement, which you see here on that slide, cold stress, which we'll talk about a little bit more. This is what happens to manatees when it gets too cold and they can't find warm water. And then emaciation, which is our most recent cause of death. So this manatee is essentially starving. This is an orphan calf that I mentioned before, that we're seeing more orphan calves through this unusual mortality event. So manatee numbers at Blue Spring, they're really going up, right? This is pretty exciting. So we think that the reason that this is happening is because there is an increase in population, but also this area is a sanctuary. Nobody's bothering them here. It provides warm habitat, it provides food, it provides shelter, it provides all the things that a manatee needs to be happy. Cora has been telling me that the manatees that are in Blue Spring are typically larger than manatees that we see in other areas of the state. The calves that are born there are weaned more quickly, and the female calves are having mothers are having calves more frequently there. So that's a good news story for manatees. All of those things that you see in the little red dots there are the reasons that we're excited about Blue Spring. So all of this work that is done by Cora and Wayne is, and then the rescues and the rehabilitation takes a huge partnership. So we are part of the Manatee Rescue and Rehabilitation Partnership. You can see all of those members on this slide. It's a huge network of very dedicated staff, very dedicated scientists who are out there looking for manatees, tracking them, taking care of them day in, day out, 24 hours a day. So back to manatees and our situation now. We love them. They're gorgeous. Who doesn't get excited about seeing these little sweet faces? But they are imperiled. So we have, they encounter these types of threats: the watercraft injuries, the emaciation, the cold stress. Again, we're seeing more and more starvation due to lack of seagrass and harmful algal blooms related to water quality, degradation, human manatee conflicts like boat motors and entanglement, being crushed by locks in our massive drainage system, and then also harassment from humans, which puts them in harm's way, usually in times when they really need to seek that refuge. Are you helping me out here? Thanks. Okay. So one of the threats to manatees are harmful algal blooms. Most of you know what these are. You're here, you're near the Indian River Lagoon. They grow when they occur when algae grows out of control. They are due to nutrient runoff and warming ocean temperatures. But in certain areas where we have harmful algal blooms, we end up with red tide, which it has a toxin, and other algal blooms have toxins as well. But primarily on the West Coast, we end up seeing manatees who are directly impacted by these harmful algal blooms because of these toxins. So it causes seizures in the animals, and they can't rise to breathe, so they end up drowning. So that's the biggest concern with direct algal blooms. Cold stress is another Another issue for manatees that I talked about, and again, we know that manatees have died of cold stress throughout their entire, since they've been here. But the fact that we are seeing less and less places for them to go in those cold times is very concerning. So what happens with them is that their immune systems shut down, they become more prone to infections, and typically they'll die from that. You can identify a cold stress animal because they're lethargic. Again, this is very similar to what was being seen when we first learned of the emaciation. So they're skinny, they're lethargic, they have these white lesions on their face, and then they have this rapid breathing. So why do we have conflict? Why do we have these watercraft injuries? Why can't we just all get along? Well, manatees like to be in the same place that humans are. They like to be in shallow waters. They like to be in these shelter areas. And so, of course, they live as close to the shoreline, and that's where we like to recreate. The biggest threat aside from the UME, and has been a long-term threat, is boats. Again, I let you know that power boats were in Florida since the early 1900s. So each year they represent about 30% of the manatee mortality. It can be more or less depending on the year, but that's a pretty standard number. And Florida just passed 1 million boats registered in the state. So that is 1 boat for every 30 people. That's a lot of boats. One of the things that we know about boating is that we don't have a true licensure. A lot of times people will say, why don't you just take the people's license away when they don't obey speed limits? Well, we don't have a licensing program. We just have a training program or a education program. So the other thing that happens is that people don't know what those signs mean, those idle speed signs or the slow speed signs. So I'm going to tell you now so you can remember and tell all your friends. When you see an idle speed sign, it means that you are going at the speed of rate with your boat that just allows you to steer and control. A slow speed is that your boat is flat in the water, and your boat is flat and you're going just the speed to keep it flat. So those are important things to designations to know. And the boating community is right when they say that not everybody knows these things, and it's not really publicly available unless you really go looking for it. So there is a challenge there with enforcing that. But there's some things that you can do if you're boating. You can wear polarized sunglasses. So polarized sunglasses versus non-polarized, huge difference. Designate a spotter. This is a great situation for your kids. If you have them or grandkids or whomever is on the boat with you, tell them to look out for manatees. The other thing that we need to do is obey those speed line zones at all times. So that means that you have to be an attentive boater. You have to be looking for those speed signs and know your area. I was talking to somebody from the Forest Service recently, and she said, we have a statement, it's called know before you go. So know where you're gonna be, know what those speed zones are, and just make sure that you're obeying those signs. I have some boater safety cards in the back if anybody wants to take them for yourselves, your neighbors. Another threat to manatees is monofilament line and other debris. So manatees die from the external wounds that they receive, but then they also die when that monofilament is ingested. So every time you're on the water, make sure you're throwing away your monofilament line in these handy dandy tubes that get collected frequently, and then just pick up all your trash. Lastly, as more people come to Florida, and whoops, if you see an entangled manatee, and this is very important, we'll talk about it more, but you want to call Fish and Wildlife Commission. Don't try to remove that yourself. Another increasing threat for manatees is harassment. So we're seeing more and more people recreate in Florida's waters. They like to see manatees. Manatees are curious beings. They will come up to them. The best thing that we can tell you to do is just don't interact with the manatee, even if they're interacting with you. In certain areas of the state, people can go on manatee tours. Just if you're able to do those, great. We ask you to practice passive observation from a distance. Again, I mentioned before, but the reason that we're very concerned about this, and I'm going to go back, is that this happens a lot of times in our springs when manatees need to conserve that energy so that they can stay warm and then go out and feed and come back. So when we are harassing manatees in our springs, we're really threatening them even more because they're not going to come visit that. They're not going to come over winter there anymore if they're not safe. And that's one of the reasons that we think that Blue Spring is such a haven. I think on this one. Caitlin's going to play a quick refresher.
Hi, I'm Trinket, and I love to boat, and I also love manatees. Here's a few quick tips on what you can do to boat safely and watch out for manatees at the same time. Polarized sunglasses help to cut the glare to make it easier to see manatees in the water. Go slow on manatee habitats and obey the posted speed zones. Watch for manatee snouts as they come up for air and look for manatee footprints. A manatee footprint is a circular pattern that it makes on the top of the water when it swims. Before starting your boat, check around the propeller for manatees. While out on the water, remember to dispose of your trash and your fishing line properly so that manatees and other wildlife do not get entangled or injured by these items. Remember that it's against the law to feed or give water to manatees. Report a sick or injured manatee to the FWC at 1-888-404-3922. Did you know Save the Manatee Club provides free boating banners, decals, and waterway cards for boaters? Educate others about these tips so they can help you be on the lookout while boating.
Somebody not understand the sign that says idle speed.
Well, we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute, but I wanted to let you know that these videos, along with a lot of other videos, are on our YouTube channel. You can go to our website and download them, put them on your social media, send them out to friends. There's a lot of educational information on our website that's available in this format. So have a look and, hopefully you'll learn something. So an important thing to know if you're on the waterway is how to report a sick or injured manatee. We ask you to call the Fish and Wildlife Commission hotline at 1-888-404-3922. If you can, stay with that manatee, measure its respiration, and take a video or some photos if you can. Oop. So I want to leave with some good news for the Indian River Lagoon, some good news for manatees, because we never want to just be so bleak. But we're seeing some positive things. The Indian River Lagoon report card is showing some water quality improvements in certain areas. We have, even though the seagrasses aren't necessarily recovering at this time, it's good news because it'll set the stage, hopefully, for some successful restoration projects. We have a network of experts that are involved in restoration, and then we have efforts to restore the access to those natural springs along the East Coast. So again, this report card is showing that there's water quality improvements in the Sebastian River area and the Sebastian area of the Indian River Lagoon. And again, even if we don't see the seagrass recovery immediately, it is setting the stage for successful restoration. This slide is showing you 52, I believe, projects that the Indian River Lagoon National Estuary Program has funded. It goes to a network of organizations. The MRC is one of them, Brevard Zoo, others who are doing work in the lagoon to restore oyster and clam beds, to restore seagrasses, to educate the public, to research the issues. So this is a multi-billion-dollar problem. It's not going to fix itself overnight, but there are dedicated people, dedicated scientists, long-term solutions that are being put in play. And then lastly, Save the Manatee Club is very involved in efforts to restore the Ocklawaha River. I didn't mention before, but the Ocklawaha River, the Rodman Dam that impounds the Ocklawaha River drowns, we'll call it drowning, 20 springs that could provide habitat for manatees, and also impedes access to Silver Springs, which is a group of 30 additional springs that, if not long-term habitat, could at least provide some winter refuge for them. So we're looking at 50 springs here that are impacted by this dam, and it is a 50-year-old boondoggle. It is far past its time. It serves no public purpose. It was created for the cross-Florida barge canal that was never constructed. So there's been a lot of pressure to keep the dam, but we are noticing that folks are having a little bit of a change of heart. There's different perceptions now. We've found that over 75% of residents typically support restoration of that Ocklawaha River. And just some tips on how to help protect manatees. If you're a Florida resident, get a manatee license plate. All of that money goes for research. Save the Manatee Club doesn't give any of that money. It's not affiliated with us. We help to get it started, but it does go to Fish and Wildlife Commission. Report manatee injuries, as I mentioned before, the Fish and Wildlife Commission. Help conserve water and reduce or eliminate fertilizer use in your yard. Do your homework if you're going to go on one of these tours. Make sure that you're touring with a company that respects manatees. And then manatees over profit. Be manatee minded when you're in the waters. Use those tips that I gave you before, and then recycle your fishing line. Be a good human. Pick up your trash. That's it. So I'm here for questions if anybody has any. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kim. We are going to be starting to take questions. So for everyone in the audience, if you have questions, oh, perfect. Cara is walking around. You can hand your note cards to her. As a reminder, we're not going to be taking questions by raised hands. So if you need another note card, there are a bunch in the back that you can feel free to grab from. All right, Kim. So our first question is, where do the manatees in the Indian River Lagoon drink fresh water? Do they find a natural source somewhere and then come back to the lagoon?
There are canals and tributaries all throughout the lagoon. And so I don't, they inhabit the entire area. They'll travel back and forth through freshwater sources into the lagoon, and the tidal, there's fresh water coming in from, again, those tributaries. People find them in their canals, people find them all over. So they do have a way to get to those sources.
Okay. Are other identification methods being explored to allow for ease of tracking and data collection?
Well, I didn't mention the way that some of our researchers are tracking manatees. So when a manatee goes in for rehabilitation and then is released, oftentimes they are tracked. So they're tracked by satellite. Researchers will go out and look for those animals. And I could defer to Cora if you think you have anything more to add to that.
Sure, yeah, I can add a little bit to that. So like Kim said, some of the manatees are tagged with satellite tags. Also, every manatee that's being rescued for any reason or rehabilitated gets a little microchip implanted. It's called a pit tag. It's very similar to what you would put in your dog or your cat. And then if it's ever re-rescued or the carcass is found, you can scan it and then see what kind of what manatee it was. Obviously, if it swims by in your canal, you won't be able to see it. So we use scars mostly to identify.
Okay, I'm going to botch the pronunciation of this, but do manatees eat the alga Caulerpora purifera, which is recently abundant in parts of the Indian River Lagoon?
Yeah, they do eat Caulerpora, and that is one of the, that's the macroalgae that contributed to those digestive issues that led to that. That's one of the algae that led to those digestive issues that led to the 2013 UME. So in a pinch, I think that they will eat it. They're pretty indiscriminate. They'll eat up to 60 different types of plants. And so whatever's available is what they'll eat.
Gotcha. The follow-up question to that was, is it actually nutritious? So it sounds
I
like
would
it's
say
not.
no, not the best source for them.
All right. I'm happy to see the supplemental feeding efforts in the north end of Brevard County, but I'm still concerned about the emaciated manatees in the south end. Is there a plan to help those manatees?
Yeah, we are not involved in those plans. That's the Fish and Wildlife Service. So they are still working diligently on this project.
Okay. Are there current discussions around incentivizing registered boaters to practice safe driving?
I can't speak to that, but we do education and outreach to boaters as much as we can. And we are working with Fish and Wildlife Commission to try to add more education for boaters who are becoming trained. In Florida, you don't have to take that boater safety course unless you were born after 1988. So there's a good number of our population who was born before that time that has no requirement to learn anything about safe boating. We encourage everyone to learn about safe boating, whether you're operating a boat for the first time and you're a resident here, or you're coming to Florida to boat and recreate in our waterways. Please spend some time learning about the signage, how to navigate our waterways and be a good boater.
Awesome. What is the age of maturity for manatees?
3 years is when they become fecundant, reach fecundity. I'm letting Cora answer that one.
Sure. Yeah. So the females usually around the age of 4 or 5. There's some that mature a little bit earlier, some a little bit later, and I think the males is around 7 to 9. So the males take a little bit longer. And so since the average lifespan of a manatee, unfortunately, these days is only between 7 and 13. That's very young, especially since we just heard they can live to be over 60 years old. So knowing that they don't mature very early is another concern. Because a lot of them don't even reach the age of maturity or just barely reach it. So.
Do you think the Brevard County spraying of the herbicide glyphosate contributes to the reduced seagrass in the Indian River Lagoon?
I cannot speculate on that, but we are looking into it. I know the MRC is also doing research and some citizen science projects to learn more about the impacts of glyphosate. Glyphosate has been found in the tissues of manatees, and there is some evidence that it causes some renal failure from a manatee, renal issues, I should say. From a manatee perspective, we are seeing some impacts of glyphosate. As far as what its impact is to seagrass loss in the Indian River Lagoon, I can't speculate on that.
Okay. What was the condition of Blue Springs before the herbicide ban?
Blue Spring, again, has always been a place for manatees to overwinter. So it was heavily used by humans since we've kind of developed the area. The herbicide spraying, herbicide moratorium has been in place for about 20 years or more. So it's really difficult to know what, I mean, we didn't have as many manatees at that time. We were using it as a recreational area. From talking to Fish and Wildlife Commission over this past year, which we're starting to coordinate with them more, there isn't a huge difference between the area that is sprayed and the area that isn't, just visually speaking. But so that's what I would say is that I don't have a comparison of Blue Spring before or after the herbicide spraying or the moratorium, just because it's been in place for so long.
All right. Is there any chance that the Manatee Protection Plan will be repeated?
There's nothing in the statute that requires those manatee protection plans to be repeated or updated in any way. If a local government wants to update theirs, they have the authority to do that at their own discretion. So it would be on an individual localized basis.
Right. Given the decline of seagrass, what other aquatic grasses and vegetation may be introduced or planted to bolster the manatee diet?
Well, the Indian River Lagoon has a diverse type of seagrasses that would grow here naturally, and I don't think that anything's off the table. So anything that would naturally grow here would be part of those restoration efforts, and I'm not well versed enough to speak to what those different types of grasses would be.
All right.
But there are people in your community who do know. So I would say reach out to the Marine Resources Council, reach out to Brevard Zoo, reach out to any of the different organizations that are part of the Indian River Lagoon Coalition or the Indian River Lagoon National Estuary Program, and they can get you those answers.
Will the increase in Blue Springs population exceed carrying capacity?
The Blue Spring, I don't know that they've done a carrying capacity for manatees, although I can let Cora answer that. Yeah, I do know that the MFL is based on the number of manatees that are expected to be there. That's the minimum flow and level. So the minimum flow for Blue Spring is based on that. But I'll let Cora answer the question about the carrying capacity for manatees.
It's kind of difficult to say because we also need to understand if we're looking at carrying capacity in terms of warm water or in carrying capacity in terms of food sources. There were some estimates for carrying capacity a long time ago, and this carrying capacity has definitely been surpassed. They were saying, you know, Blue Spring could support maybe 200 or 300 manatees. Well, right now we're seeing over 700 individuals using that area, actually over 800, and they comfortably fit into the warm water side. There's definitely more room for them. Now, if we're looking at food sources in the area, like Kim said, the area around there is a moratorium in the winter time. So no spraying, no mechanical harvesting, any of that. And we are working very closely with other agencies to make sure that we're keeping a good eye on what's available food-wise for them and whether these moratoriums have to be extended. Because as we're seeing more manatees using that area, maybe more manatees coming from the East Coast to use that area, what is that going to mean for the Blue Spring area? Are we reaching carrying capacity? You know, are we having enough vegetation there? We've also seen some loss of submerged vegetation in the St. Johns River. So we're definitely keeping a very close eye on what's available from vegetation-wise and whether we have to add to the existing moratorium to accommodate more manatees in the area. Right now, I don't think it's an issue, but it's definitely something we're keeping an eye on.
And those carrying capacity studies, like Cora said, were done a long time ago. We've surpassed them. There are some moratoriums that have been put in place recently in the Silver Glen area of the Ocala National Forest. So we're seeing Fish and Wildlife Commission putting those types of management efforts in place in other areas. And we're hoping to have some more updated information about how effective those are in the near future. And hopefully maybe more of them.
Given their strong site fidelity, will the Indian River Lagoon manatees seek out and relocate to other areas that have ample supply of seagrass?
I think that is to be determined, but based on our observations at Blue Spring this past year, we're seeing manatees from Brevard County go up into Blue Spring. So as more accessible areas, more accessible warm water sites become available, there could be an expectation that they'll find them. This situation with the power plants and the Indian River Lagoon losing its seagrass, well, the power plants have been in place for almost 100 years now. And so that's been a long-term spot for them to go. We're finding manatees in areas recently that we haven't seen them before. We had some good news about Gemini Spring that received some vegetation management, some harvesting in 2020 and in 2021. The residents were seeing manatees in those areas. We're seeing more manatees in Wekiva. So the manatees are moving around and they're able to find those places. So if we can give them to them, I think it will take time, but they are able to figure these things out.
What is being done to mitigate the effect on manatees when the power plants go offline?
I think that's what I was talking about before, is just these efforts to figure out what, it is a big issue. It has been going on for a long time. We are looking toward opening up those springs, restoring some of these natural systems, finding out where they might be able to be that they haven't been in the past. So again, just working really diligently I should have mentioned before, we had a $30 million infusion commitment by Governor DeSantis yesterday to work on manatee rescue and rehabilitation and habitat restoration. So hopefully some of that money will go toward looking at restoring these springs. Last year we had an $8 million allocation, and those monies went toward some projects on the West Coast, but some projects on the East Coast. One project that's going on the West Coast is restoration at warm mineral springs. So looking to increase the accessibility for manatees there. So we're seeing those types of projects come online.
Right. Can you talk a little bit about the Crystal River cleanup and seagrass planting? And if there's any possibility of them doing that here?
Yeah, I can't speak to whether or not they can do that here, but the Crystal River Vallisneria is pretty much a freshwater type grass. So there would potentially be application here. They're calling it the rockstar grass. In Crystal River, there was a major lingua problem, and through coordinated efforts with the Southwest Florida Water Management District and Save Crystal River, and a huge community effort, they are continually planting this rockstar Vallisneria, and they've had a lot of success. It is somewhat a newer project, so while we're seeing a lot of success, we are cautiously optimistic to see how long that's going to be a viable system. And I do know that the folks who are doing those plantings are talking with folks over here to see what that viability might be over here as well.
Great. Do you have any idea what the estimated time frame for seagrass regeneration to a sustainable level would be?
No.
I don't think anyone.
I would love to talk to whoever does. But I do think that, we're going to see these, hopefully we see restoration happening and we see it happen quickly, but there will be a point where we get to an adequate restoration, but we need to be looking forward into not just having adequate restoration of the system, but a safety measure, like that safety level. I can't remember, reasonable assurance, I guess is the word, to make sure that any smaller catastrophe doesn't set us back to the same position that we're in today. So it will just be restoration and then some, I think that's my opinion, and what's going to have to happen.
Will orphaned calves be able to find food, warm water, refuge, etc., with no mom to touch them?
Cora can probably speak to this more, but a great characteristic of manatees is that we do find manatee mothers who will take on orphan calves. And a lot of those calves are rescued through our rescue and rehabilitation program, but they also do take on other calves. And I don't know if Cora has any explanation or examples of that she'd like to share.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty awesome that sometimes the calves actually do get adopted by mothers. It has happened. So anytime before a calf is rescued, we make extra sure that it's definitely orphaned and it's definitely not getting adopted by anyone, because that would be a best case scenario. We really don't want to pull out a calf out of its environment. Unfortunately, a calf without a mom can definitely not survive on its own. They do need to nurse for at least the first year of its life. They need to learn migration routes. They need to find learn how to find food, and a calf cannot do that on its own. So if it is orphaned, it has to be rescued, and it's a really prolonged process. Orphan calves have to be in rehab sometimes for 3 to 4 years, which is a really long time. They have to reach a weight of 600 pounds in order to be released. So orphans are, around 60 to 70 pounds. So it takes a really long time for them to grow to that size. And then, they are released and have to then learn how to be a wild manatee. So it's a difficult process for them. And seeing that many orphan calves right now due to the unusual mortality event, it's a big concern. It's also a big capacity concern. These manatees take up a lot of room in our rehab facilities. So we're adding on new partners, but it's still a challenge.
What companies do you recommend for safe manatee tourism?
We have a Guardian Guides program through Save the Manatee Club. And while I don't know all of them off the top of my head, I would recommend that you go to Guardian Guides. It is just Google Guardian Guides. The website's a little tricky, but there's about 11 vendors on there throughout the state who are committed to responsible manatee ecotourism.
This is more of a MapQuest question. How do manatees get to Blue Springs from the Indian River Lagoon? I'm kind of curious about that.
They do have to travel up the coast, so they cannot access Blue Spring directly from the Indian River Lagoon. They have to find an entry in through that St. Johns River system. Yeah. Oh yeah. So the St. Johns River meets up with the Atlantic Ocean around Jacksonville, Green Cove Springs. So a bit north. And it's interesting, if you don't know already, the St. Johns River flows south to north. So it starts in the Harris Chain of Lakes, swampy areas down in near Orlando, and then flows north to Jacksonville, Green Cove Springs area.
Are there plans for a manatee rehabilitation center with the construction of Port Canaveral's aquarium?
Oh, I can't speak to their plans. I know that some of the funding is going to manatee capacity expansion. I don't know exactly where that will be. I'm looking at Cora to see if she knows. No, okay. No, okay.
Maybe. I think that'd be great.
Maybe.
I heard that.
Oh, okay.
Maybe.
We'll perpetuate some rumors around here. That's good.
It'll be a long time.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's one of the issues, and I'll just kind of is that these projects take time to complete, and we're in a crisis now. So we are having capacity issues throughout the last winter and the winter before, and we're just really looking for some expansions to happen quickly. So it's all hands on deck for those.
Awesome. All right. Well, we are coming to the close of our Lunch and Learn. Kim, I will just leave you with, if you would like to tell us how we can best help the Save the Manatee Club, whether it's through donations or volunteering.
Yeah.
If you want to close off with that.
Those are 2 great ways to help Save the Manatee Club. We have donation information on our website. We are taking donations for habitat restoration projects, as well as the overall rescue and rehabilitation program. So we don't have our own facilities, but we support those, the rescue and rehabilitation program administratively and through our fiscal assistance with them. And then our volunteers typically had been just on the educational side, manning tents for us at festivals or providing educational programs for kids, either virtually or in person. But we have kind of a newer program when we're really excited about the number of people who want to volunteer and do some true feet on the ground, get wet and dirty type of activities. So we're always updating our calendar to let people know when those are happening around here. You can volunteer on Save the Manatee Club, savethemanatee.org as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.